Everybody has a gift, but my grandfather had a gift other than storytelling, was relationship, having an idea of what animals need. He could almost communicate with them. And in those days, when he was a young man, he could mimic every bird. He could mimic any bird. He practiced the whistle, the sounds, the songs. But then he got older and he lost his teeth and he couldn't do it anymore. He tried, but it sounded funny. But he could whistle really good. And growing up next door to him, I always knew of him taking care of animals. And like I remember he had a raccoon, he would have a hawk, he had an owl at one time, he had a woodchuck. He always would have animals, and people started to realize in the area that he had a way with them and he could nurture them if they were injured, and he could take care of them. And like there was a red-tailed hawk, I remember, and a sharp-shinned hawk that he had, that one of them was shot and it had, its wing was busted. And with those birds, they don't heal, so it's once they're broke, that's it. And it would die out in the wild. And so what he did is he would, they liked chicken necks. I don't know if they still sell that. They had the chicken necks and they loved it. But he would chop it up for them, and the hawks would just get down there and climb and they would eat. And but I remember them because I could communicate with them, and not serious conversations or anything. But we would go over and I knew how to mimic them. And they would lighten up when I came over because they knew they had somebody to visit. And I'd go over and they bow. When they know like they like you, they bow. And they kind of go like this and they get excited. And then they'll run away and they kind of like play. And I knew how to whistle like the sharp shin. And I haven't done it in years, but it was just a simple like, just like that. And it's real subtle, you could barely hear it. And but the sharp shin hawk was my buddy. And I remember as a kid, I'd go over every day to see him. But my grandfather, he was, I guess what they call him today is a wildlife rehabilitator. But back in those days, you didn't need a license for that. You just, if you had that gift, you took care of animals. So from time to time, people would bring an injured animal to him. And if they were nurtured enough or healthy enough, he would let them go. And I remember an owl he had, and it was, I can't remember if it was hit by a car, but it was stunned. And it was a great horned owl, those big ones. And so we got in his truck and he made me carry him. And if you ever know the talons of an owl, they're powerful and they're sharp. And he had just a welder's glove. Those are pretty thick. And I had them on my arm and I had to cover them, but I could feel that grip getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and it was going through, and I'm like, hurry up, Grandpa. And but anyways, we got to that point and we let him go. And I had little marks on my arm and went right through that welder's glove. But he was powerful. And another thing about my grandfather is that, he lived at Akwesasne for a number of years, and then he moved to Anchayota in, I think it was 1957. And there, one day, there was, he noticed that, you ever have those suet that you put in a cage? And a lot of the birds like that, woodpeckers. But every morning he'd get up and it was always gone. Then he'd find it way out in the woods, all, ripped apart. And he's like, that's weird. They must be hungry. So you get another one and hang it up. Next morning, the thing's ripped apart, gone again. And he's like, geez, that's strange. So he's going to stay up late, see what it is. And then finally he heard this noise and he looked out and it was a bear, a black bear. And he was out and he just took that thing right off the tree and ripped it up. And it was good. And then, but then my grandfather looked at it and it was skinny. It was so thin and even the ribs were like showing. And what he realized is that down the road a ways, there was a landfill. That the bears would go there and they'd eat, and they closed it and they covered everything up. And so those bears, they became accustomed to that landfill, and so there was nothing left to eat, and they just were so they had no other means of getting food than the dump, and so they kind of just in that sense it's not good. And so he felt bad for them, and so what he did is he went down to the local butcher, and they have a lot of meat that they just throw away, or he calls it scraps, stuff they cut. And but he'd put it in these boxes and he'd bring it home. It was probably illegal, but he did this and he put it out back behind his house on this rock up on a hill. And the bears started to come. And I remember one would be there, and then two. Then pretty soon that bear went and he told his friend down the road, and that bear showed up. And then that guy told another bear and he showed up. Before long there was about 19 bears a night. And that became an operation. Every Wednesday and Saturday we'd go to town, load up with suet and put it out back. And that was my job when my grandfather got older, carrying that stuff. Ugh, it was nasty. because he would leave it in his truck in the summer, and it was pretty rancid. But and I'd go back and I'd carry it, and I remember that rock. It was this big rock where they'd all come up. You couldn't even stand on it. It was so greasy from all the meat and the fat. But those bears in the fall, they'd eat so much their bellies would rub on the ground. Because my grandfather's the type of guy that thinks everything's starving to death. He'd feed and feed and feed and feed. He had this one cat. He only, what do you call it? Kitty cat, original name. But it was this cat he rescued, and when he got it, it was normal. But by the time that cat was there a couple of years, that thing was like a ball with a little head on top. He just overfed everything. And I'm surprised the birds could fly around his house. They eat so much. But anyway, so he got to be known for that. And but when he taught school, he finished his teaching career down in Saranac towards Plattsburgh. And then, but we get company from the reservation, and we still do to this day. People come up to visit. And but this one particular day, my grandfather was home, and he hears this car pull up, and he goes out to the window, and he looked out, and he saw this family get out, and he recognized one of the young boys as one of his students from the reservation. He says, "Oh, I think his name was Leonard Tarrant," and he saw his parents, and so he went out to greet them, and he noticed the boy was carrying this box, and my grandfather went out to the steps, and they came up, and they said their hellos, and my grandfather, "What's in the box?" And the little boy goes, "I found this in the woods, and I don't know what to do with it." And he gave it to my grandfather. He goes, "What is it?" And he opened it up, and he looked in. Inside was this little baby porcupine, about this big, this little tiny thing. My grandfather looked at it and goes, "Where'd you find this?" He goes, "I was in the woods behind my house, and I saw him on a log all by himself, so I took him home." My grandfather says, "You should never do that. If you see a little baby animal, leave it alone. Don't go near it. Don't touch it. Because what they do is the mothers will leave to go forage for food, and then they'll come back. And the babies, it's almost instinctive, is that they don't move. Even a fawn, a little deer, if there's any commotion going on, that fawn will be a statue. But the mother will make all kinds of noise and snort and make these sounds and run around to draw danger away from that baby." And one time there was my grandfather had a dog named Spot. And my grandfather was in the woods, and he sees that Spot, rah, 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 started barking his head off, and then see this deer making all this noise, and the deer took off, and Spot took off right after the deer. And my grandfather just stood there in the woods and waited, and he looked around, and he saw a fawn just not moving at all. Then he could hear that dog barking way off in the distance. Then that mother deer came back. So meanwhile, that dog's probably still running that way. But that's what they do. And so my grandfather said, "When'd you get this?" He goes, "Oh, it was yesterday. He slept on my pillow last night." Oh, because that mother's probably long gone. And he also heard too that if that little baby has a human scent, that the mother's apt to not take care of it because it has a weird scent to it. So my grandfather says, "Well, we can't bring him back." He says, "Well, we'll see if we can raise it." So they visited, and then that family went back to the reservation, and my grandfather looked in that box, and there's that little baby porcupine. He goes, "How do we feed it?" He goes, "Well, it's so little, maybe we'll try milk." So he got to the fridge, poured some milk in the pan, and warmed it up over the fire. Not too hot, just enough. And he's like, "How am I going to feed this little guy?" He looked in a drawer, and he's looking around, and he found a little eyedropper. He goes, "Oh, this might work." So he picked up that little porcupine, put him in his hand, and he got some drops of milk, one drop at a time. And that little porcupine started to drink it. That was a good sign. Because a lot of those babies, they need their mother. And most times, 9 times out of 10, they don't make it. But this little guy grabbed right on, and he was drinking that milk. Finished it off. Put him back in the box, and he went to sleep. An hour later, he hears this little whine, this like cry. Oh, he's hungry again. Warmed up some more milk, and eyedropper kept feeding it. Put him back. Another hour goes by. He's hungry again. They come up, do the same thing. Every hour on the hour, all night long, you had to feed him to make sure he would live. One day it turned into 2. 2 days turned into a week. And pretty soon that little porcupine was growing. He was getting bigger. He was getting healthy. And he seemed, he was getting more active. And he was running around the house. And, he was just like all little babies. He was playing. And so he was healthy. And that was very good because he lived. So it got to that point, and they said, "Well, we got to give him a name." Guess what they named him? Needles. Makes sense, huh? So Needles the porcupine, that was his name. Now Needles, when he started to grow, he got to be kind of famous in the Adirondacks. Because everywhere my grandfather went, Needles was right there by his side or even riding on his back. So if my grandfather had to go to town or go to the post office, Needles had to go too, because that was his mother. So my grandfather hop in his truck and Needles is there and he'd sit on his lap and Needles would put his little paws on the wheel and look out. And so cars driving by, see this porcupine driving this truck. You know? And he'd put him on his back, he'd be walking into the post office. Nobody's, locals knew him, but he'd get tourists, they're like, oh my God, and they're taking pictures and there's newspaper articles written about him. And so he's probably one of the most famous porcupines in the Adirondacks. But my grandfather, like I said before, overfed everything. And no exception was Needles. And Needles, when he got to be an adult and full grown, guess what his favorite food was? Bananas and burnt toast. It had to be black. No butter, just black. Maybe that resembles bark or something, because that's what they eat. But he could eat about 4 or 5 bananas at a sitting, peel and all. He didn't peel the banana, he'd just eat it. And that burnt toast, he loved that. And they make this little noise when they eat too. They make this little whine. But anyways, a normal porcupine is about 20 pounds. That's pretty big. Guess how much Needles got to weigh? 45 pounds. He was huge, he was big. But he was so happy, he was well fed and he was pampered. And another thing about Needles is that when he was a little baby, a little guy, little tiny thing, and then he'd go to the bathroom, it wasn't too bad. Little guy, just easy to clean up. But when he ate 6 bananas and burnt toast and he went to the bathroom, it wasn't so nice. And so my grandfather was the type of guy, he could live with that. He's like, yeah, whatever. But my grandmother lived there too. And she says, Ray, we got to do something about this. And so my grandfather thought about it. And he says, well, let's try a litter pan, like a cat. So he got a pan and he got gravel and paper and made it up and looked around and went to the bathroom. And under the sink in the bathroom was a nice spot. Put it in there. So all he had to do was wait for the next accident. Didn't take long. I heard my grandmother say, Ray, there's another one on the rug in the living room. So my grandfather get up, put his pipe down, go over. Where's Needles? Look around. He found him. You know how you punish a cat? You rub your nose in it, you go, bad cat, then you show it to the litter pan. But you do that with a porcupine. Bad porcupine, rubbed his nose in it, and he went over to the bathroom and set him in that litter pan and sat there and watched. And the poor Needles was there looking. Didn't know. Next time, did the same thing. Next time, same thing. 2 weeks it took. He learned how to use the litter pan. No more accidents. Who would have thought? Who would have imagined that? Every time he'd have to go, he'd just wander into the bathroom under the sink where that litter pan was, and he'd say, there. Who would have imagined that? But anyways, like I said, Needles, he was a pretty big guy, and but everywhere my grandfather went, he was there, and he even had a little area in his room where he would sleep at night. And till finally this one night, my grandfather, it was probably about 1 or 2 in the morning. He was sound asleep, and something woke him up. He hears this little ruckus, and he wakes up, and he couldn't really see, and then he listened, he could hear this really sad, almost like a cry, something whimpering, really sad. He goes, what is that? And he turned on his light and he looked over, and there was Needles. He was on his back legs and he was up looking out the window, going like this, and he was crying and whimpering, and what's the matter, Needles? And he went up and he turned on the outside light and he looked. There were other porcupines out there. And right then and there, his heart sank. He says, what I'm doing is wrong. Even though he loved them so much, and it was like having another kid. He says, I'm doing it wrong. He doesn't belong in here. He should be out there. So that next day, my grandmother and my grandfather talked it over. He says, well, that's the best thing to do. We'll just let him go. He belongs in nature. This is wrong. It's like taking an eagle and putting him in a cage. Just, isn't right. So even though they were so attached to him, they had to let him go. So what they did that day is they opened up the back door, and Needles took off 100 miles an hour. He was so happy. He was free. Took off, and my grandfather watched as he disappeared over the hill behind the house. He was gone. So the rest of that day, they moped and they were sad. It was like one of their kids went off to college. The house seemed empty. And they wandered and looked around, and then finally my grandfather started to worry. He goes, we've pampered him so much. He doesn't know much about the woods. And he got thinking his neighbor down the road, he has traps for the fisher. And sometimes there's beaver traps. And he goes, needles. He might be wandering around, get his foot stuck in that. We'll never know. Oh, he started to worry. And every time a car would zip by, he'd wonder, oh, geez, maybe he's walking down the middle of the road. And all these thoughts came into his head. He started to worry. And finally he says, well, I got to go look. So he went out in the woods and went all the way around his house, and needles, no sign of him. He was a good tracker, but there's so many animals, he couldn't find his tracks. No sign of him, he was gone. Sun went down, it got dark. They had their supper, watched the news, went to bed. Middle of the night, my grandmother hands him a flashlight. You get out there and keep looking. So my grandfather got out and he got to turn that flashlight on, and he went all over the woods, and he heard a noise and it was rustling. He looked over, clicked his flashlight on. It was a raccoon. Nope. Kept on going. He hears this another noise. Oh, nope, just a bear. Kept on going. Heard another noise. Oh, it's a porcupine. Oh, too thin. Wasn't him. Up and down the road, in the ditches, looking around all night long. He did this radius all around his house. Needles. No sign of him. He was gone. Well, he tried. So he went home, and the sun was coming up early morning, and he made some coffee, and he said, oh, I might as well stay up. And so he had his coffee at the table, and he opened up the back door just to look out the porch where that hill was, and he was sipping his coffee, and your eyes are getting like this, and something moved on top of the hill. He saw these ferns shaking, and he put his coffee down, and he looked. Something's coming down the trail. And he got on the porch, he opened up the screen door, and he looked, and the ferns are really moving, and pew! It's needles. What a relief. It was just like a weight was lifted right off, and oh, you know that feeling. Needles, he made it. He's coming home, and he's, Christine, that's my grandmother. Needles, he's alive, and she got up, and oh, what a relief. They're just about crying. And here comes Needles barreling down that hill. He's so happy too. And here he comes, and my grandfather's getting ready to pick him up and give him a big hug. And here comes Needles going about 90 miles an hour. Twigs and branches kicking in the air, and here he comes up the steps. My grandfather's going to pick him up, give him a big hug. And what does he do? Doesn't even look at him. Goes right between his legs on the porch, and there's my grandmother at the door. What does he do? Doesn't even look at her. Goes right past her. He's going about 100 miles an hour now. Goes into the kitchen, hangs a hard left down the hallway. He's going about 110 now. Hangs another left into the bathroom under the sink where his litter pan was.